Before the first heartbeat of time echoed through the void, before the concept of existence had meaning, before even the gods themselves could dream of being, there was only the infinite darkness of absolute potential. Picture this if you can. An endless ocean of primordial waters called none, stretching beyond comprehension in every direction, containing within its depths every possibility that would ever manifest, every thought that would ever be conceived, every soul that would ever draw breath. This was not merely darkness as we understand it, not simply the absence of light, but rather a darkness so profound, so complete, so utterly absolute that it existed as a positive force unto itself, a presence rather than an absence, a fullness of void that defied the very categories of existence and non-existence that our limited minds struggle to comprehend. Within this incomprehensible expanse, something stirred, not a movement as we would recognize it, for there was no space through which to move, no time in which movement could occur. Rather, it was a shift in potential, a subtle reorganization of infinite possibility that would eventually cascade into the birth of everything that has ever been or will ever be. The ancient Egyptians, those remarkable observers of cosmic truth, who built monuments that still stand after 5,000 years, understood this moment with a clarity that modern philosophy has yet to match. They called it the first stirring of divine consciousness, the moment when the undifferentiated potential of none began to recognize itself, to become aware of its own infinite nature, and in that recognition, to initiate the process that would eventually produce the ordered cosmos we inhabit today. Among the swirling chaos of these primordial waters, 8 mysterious forces began to coalesce into recognizable forms. These were not gods as later generations would understand the term, not beings with personalities and preferences and petty jealousies, but rather fundamental principles of existence itself, cosmic forces so basic and essential that without them nothing else could ever come into being. The Egyptians called them the Ogdod of Hermopolis, 4 pairs of complementary deities who embodied the fundamental elements that would eventually give birth to the ordered cosmos. Nun and None represented the primordial waters themselves, the infinite potential from which all things would emerge. He and Hauhet personified infinity, the boundless nature of existence that could never be fully measured or contained. Kek and Kauket symbolized darkness, not as evil or absence, but as the necessary condition for the emergence of light, the womb from which illumination would eventually be born. But among these 8 primordial forces, one figure would emerge whose influence would reshape the entire pantheon of ancient Egypt, whose power would eventually eclipse all other deities, whose mystery would captivate human imagination for millennia and continues to resonate with spiritual seekers to this very day. His name was Amun, and his very existence carried the weight of concealment and mystery that would define his eternal nature. The word itself, spoken in the ancient tongue, meant simply the hidden one, but this simple designation contained depths of meaning that even the most learned priests spent lifetimes attempting to fully comprehend. The origins of Amun stretch back to the earliest theological concepts of the Egyptians, when their understanding of divine forces was still fluid and malleable, when the boundaries between different aspects of cosmic power had not yet solidified into the rigid categories that would characterize later religious thought. Unlike the more clearly defined deities who would later dominate Egyptian religion, gods whose domains and attributes could be neatly catalogued and understood, Amun existed in a realm of deliberate obscurity that made him simultaneously the most accessible and the most incomprehensible of all divine beings. His emergence from the chaotic waters of none was not a dramatic birth accompanied by cosmic upheavals, not a spectacular display of divine power that announced his presence to all creation. but rather a gradual manifestation of hidden potential, so subtle that even his fellow primordial deities initially failed to recognize that something fundamentally new had entered existence. The ancient texts describe how he materialized alongside his female counterpart Amunet as twin aspects of the same fundamental force, the invisible breath that would eventually animate all living things. Consider the profound wisdom embedded in this theological concept. While other primordial deities embodied tangible elements that could be observed and measured, water and darkness and infinity, Amun and Amunet represented something far more elusive, yet infinitely more essential. They were the hidden aspects of air and wind, those invisible yet absolutely necessary elements that permeate existence without revealing their true nature. You cannot see the air you breathe, cannot touch the wind that moves across your skin, yet without these invisible forces, no life could exist, no thought could form, no consciousness could emerge from the material substrate of the brain. This hiddenness was not a limitation, not a weakness that would eventually be overcome as Amun grew in power and sophistication. Rather, it was his greatest strength, the very foundation of his eventual supremacy over all other gods. For what cannot be seen cannot be fully comprehended or controlled. What remains hidden retains infinite potential, while what is revealed becomes limited by the very act of revelation. The theological significance of Amun's concealed nature extended far beyond simple invisibility, touching upon the deepest questions about the relationship between knowledge and power, between understanding and control, between the finite categories of human thought and the infinite reality of divine existence. In ancient Egyptian thought, the act of naming something granted power over it. To know the true name of a being was to possess the ability to command that being, to bind it to your will, to limit its actions according to your desires. This is why the most powerful magical spells required knowledge of secret names, why the gods themselves guarded their true designations with jealous care, why the revelation of a divine name was considered one of the most dangerous and powerful acts possible within the cosmic order. But Amun, by embodying hiddenness itself, occupied a unique position among the primordial forces. He was the unnamed, the unknowable, the one whose true nature could never be fully captured in any designation or description. He was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, present in every breath yet impossible to locate or define, influencing every aspect of existence yet leaving no trace that could be followed or analyzed. This paradoxical existence made him a deity of immense power, for his influence could not be traced or predicted by those who might seek to oppose him. While other gods could be challenged, their domains invaded, their authority questioned, Amun remained forever beyond the reach of any force that might seek to diminish his power. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? How do you resist an influence you cannot detect? How do you oppose a will that operates through channels so subtle that even the most perceptive observers cannot identify its workings? These questions, which would have paralyzed lesser beings with their impossibility, were precisely the source of Amun's supreme authority within the cosmic order. The creation myths surrounding Amun's emergence paint a picture of gradual awakening rather than sudden appearance, a slow unfolding of divine consciousness that perfectly reflected his essential nature as the hidden one. As the primordial waters of Nun began their first stirrings toward order, as the 8 members of the Ogdod found themselves drawn together by forces they themselves did not fully understand, Amun's manifestation occurred as a subtle shift in the cosmic atmosphere, a change so gradual that even his fellow deities initially failed to recognize his presence. He was there before anyone realized he had arrived, influencing the direction of cosmic development before any other being understood that such influence was being exerted. Ancient texts describe how Amun first made his presence known through the movement of air across the surface of the primordial waters. Unlike the violent winds that would later accompany storms and tempests, this initial stirring was gentle yet persistent, creating the first ripples on the otherwise motionless surface of none. These ripples carried with them the seeds of future creation, spreading outward in ever-widening circles that would eventually encompass the entire cosmos. Yet even as his influence expanded, even as the effects of his presence became visible throughout the primordial realm, Amun himself remained hidden, working through indirect means rather than direct intervention, shaping the course of cosmic development without ever revealing the hand that guided it. The relationship between Amun and Amunet during these primordial times reflected the Egyptian understanding of cosmic balance through complementary opposites, a principle that would later be recognized in Chinese philosophy as yin and yang, in Western thought as the dialectical relationship between thesis and antithesis. While both represented hidden aspects of air and wind, their manifestations differed in subtle but crucial ways that together formed a complete system of invisible influence. Amunet embodied the nurturing breath that would sustain life, the gentle respiration that keeps organisms alive from moment to moment, the soft wind that carries seeds to fertile ground and spreads the pollen that enables plants to reproduce. Amun, by contrast, represented the animating force that would spark consciousness into being, the vital breath that transforms mere biological existence into aware, thinking, feeling life, the invisible power that distinguishes a living being from a corpse that possesses all the same physical components, but lacks the essential spark that makes existence meaningful. Together, they formed a complete system of invisible influence that would prove essential to the eventual emergence of ordered creation. Without Amunet's sustaining breath, life could not continue from one moment to the next. Without Amun's animating force, life would never begin in the first place. Their partnership represented the perfect complementarity of cosmic forces, each incomplete without the other, each finding its fullest expression only in relationship with its counterpart. This model of divine cooperation would later influence Egyptian concepts of marriage and family, of political alliance and social organization, of the proper relationship between different aspects of any complex system that required multiple components working in harmony to achieve its purposes. The symbolic power of Amun's name, meaning the Hidden One, resonated throughout Egyptian theological thought for millennia, shaping not only how other deities perceived and interacted with him, but also how human beings understood their own relationship to divine reality. This designation was not merely descriptive, a convenient label attached to a being whose nature happened to include concealment among its attributes. Rather, the name actively shaped the reality it described, creating and reinforcing the hiddenness that defined Amun's essential nature. To invoke Amun was to call upon forces that could not be fully understood or anticipated, to request assistance from a power whose methods and motivations remained forever beyond human comprehension, to place one's trust in a divine will that operated according to principles too subtle for mortal minds to grasp. His hiddenness granted him a form of divine immunity that no other deity possessed. He could act without being detected, influence without being blamed, shape events without leaving clear evidence of his involvement. When things went well, Amun could be credited with hidden assistance that had guided events toward favorable outcomes. When things went poorly, his concealed nature meant that no one could prove he had failed to provide the help that had been requested. This theological flexibility made Amun an ideal deity for worshippers facing uncertain circumstances, for rulers navigating complex political situations, for anyone who needed divine support but could not predict exactly what form that support should take. Early artistic representations of Amun from this primordial period are remarkably sparse, which itself serves as testimony to his concealed nature. How do you depict a god whose essential characteristic is invisibility? How do you create an image of a being who exists precisely by not being seen? When he does appear in the most ancient depictions, he is shown as a figure whose features seem to shift and blur, as if the artists themselves could not maintain a clear vision of his appearance, as if the very act of attempting to capture his likeness caused that likeness to dissolve and reform in new configurations. His skin is often rendered in deep blue tones, suggesting his connection to the invisible air and the hidden depths of the sky. That vast expanse above the earth that appears empty to casual observation, but actually contains the atmosphere that makes all terrestrial life possible. Unlike other deities who wore elaborate crowns or carried distinctive symbols that allowed worshippers to immediately identify them in artistic representations, Amun's early iconography emphasized simplicity and concealment. His crown, when depicted at all, consisted of two tall feathers that seemed to merge with the air around them, their edges indistinct, their colors shifting between the blue of sky and the transparency of wind. He carried no weapon, wielded no obvious symbol of power, displayed no attribute that would allow observers to categorize and therefore limit his nature. This visual ambiguity was not a failure of artistic imagination, but a deliberate theological statement, a recognition that any attempt to fix Amun's appearance in permanent form would contradict his essential nature as the one who cannot be captured, contained, or comprehended. The creation myths that feature Amun describe his role in the cosmic egg, that primordial vessel from which the ordered universe would eventually emerge. Though the specific details vary significantly across different traditions, reflecting the diverse regional origins of Egyptian religious thought, certain themes remain constant across all versions. Some accounts suggest that Amun was present within the egg from its formation, his breath providing the internal pressure necessary to maintain its integrity until the moment of hatching, his hidden presence ensuring that the developing cosmos would possess the vital force necessary for sustained existence. Other versions describe him as the hidden force that guided the egg's development from outside, shaping its growth through invisible influence, ensuring that the emerging cosmos would possess the breath of life necessary for sustained existence without ever entering the egg himself. In certain texts, Amun is credited with whispering the first words of creation, though these words were spoken so softly that only the cosmic egg itself could hear them. This image captures something essential about Amun's nature and his relationship to the creative process. He did not shout the universe into existence with dramatic displays of divine power. He did not impose his will upon chaos through force or domination. Rather, he whispered, he suggested. He gently guided the development of creation through influence so subtle that even the other primordial deities failed to recognize his contribution. The cosmos emerged not because Amun commanded it to exist, but because his hidden breath carried the potential for existence into the heart of the cosmic egg, where it could unfold according to its own inherent nature, while still reflecting the divine intention that had planted it there. However, the cosmic egg was more commonly attributed to other creator deities such as Ptah, the divine craftsman of Memphis, or Thoth, the wise scribe of the gods. This attribution pattern reveals important aspects of early Egyptian theological development and Amun's unique position within it. While Amun possessed the power to participate in creation, his hidden nature meant that his contributions were often overlooked or attributed to more visible deities. The spectacular achievements were credited to gods whose involvement could be clearly observed and documented, while Amun's subtle influence remained unrecognized, his essential contributions absorbed into the accomplishments of others. This tendency would later fuel his desire for greater recognition and ultimately drive his rise to supreme power within the Egyptian pantheon, a rise that would transform him from an obscure primordial force into the king of all gods. The theological implications of Amun's primordial hiddenness extended into practical religious observance as well, creating unique challenges for priests and worshippers who sought to establish proper relationships with this most elusive of deities. Unlike gods whose presence could be confirmed through natural phenomena, whose reality was demonstrated by observable events in the physical world, Amun's influence remained perpetually ambiguous, always present yet never provable, always active yet never visible. The sun's daily journey confirmed Ra's existence, providing daily evidence of solar divine power that no one could deny. The Nile's annual flood validated Hapi's authority, demonstrating the river god's continued involvement in Egyptian life through tangible benefits that could be measured and celebrated. But Amun's influence operated through channels too subtle for such direct confirmation, requiring entirely different methods for detecting and interpreting his will. This requirement for faith-based rather than evidence-based worship would later become a defining characteristic of Amun's religious following, distinguishing his cult from those of more obviously manifest deities. Worshippers of Amun learned to recognize his presence not through spectacular miracles or dramatic interventions, but through the subtle patterns of events that suggested hidden guidance, through the fortunate coincidences that seemed too perfectly timed to be mere chance, through the quiet inner certainty that arose during moments of sincere prayer and meditation. This approach to divine relationship anticipated by millennia the faith-based spirituality that would later characterize monotheistic religions, creating a template for worship that did not depend upon visible proof, but rather upon trust in invisible realities that transcended the limitations of sensory experience. During these earliest epochs, Amun's interactions with his fellow Ogdod members were characterized by subtle influence rather than direct confrontation, establishing patterns of divine relationship that would define his approach to cosmic politics throughout his long career. While Nun and Nona shaped the fundamental structure of the primordial waters, while Kek and Kauket defined the boundaries between existence and void, while He and Hauhet established the parameters of infinite extension, Amun worked through gentle persuasion and hidden suggestion, planting ideas in the minds of other deities, allowing them to believe these concepts were their own discoveries. This approach proved remarkably effective, as it allowed Amun to shape the direction of cosmic development without triggering the resistance that more obvious interference might have provoked. Consider the sophistication of this strategy. Direct attempts to control the actions of other primordial forces would have created conflict, would have established Amun as a rival whose ambitions needed to be checked, would have united the other members of the Ogdod against a common threat to their autonomy. But by working through hidden influence, by suggesting rather than commanding, by guiding rather than controlling, Amun achieved his purposes while maintaining the appearance of cooperative participation in a collective enterprise. The other deities believed they were acting according to their own will, pursuing their own interests, making their own contributions to the emerging cosmic order. They did not recognize that their choices had been subtly shaped by Amun's invisible influence, that their decisions reflected his hidden guidance, that the direction of cosmic development followed a plan they had never consciously agreed to follow. The ancient creation accounts describe how Amun's breath first animated the cosmic egg, though his role in this crucial moment was so subtle that even the other primordial deities failed to recognize his contribution. As the egg began to crack and the first light of creation spilled forth, as the ordered cosmos emerged from its protective shell to begin its long journey through time, Amun's hidden presence ensured that this light would be accompanied by the invisible breath necessary to sustain life. Without this contribution, the emerging cosmos would have been nothing more than a beautiful but lifeless display of divine artistry, a spectacular arrangement of matter and energy that lacked the vital force necessary to support conscious existence. The sun would have risen and set, the stars would have wheeled through their eternal courses, the earth would have formed, and the waters would have gathered, but no eye would have opened to witness these wonders. No mind would have awakened to contemplate their meaning. No soul would have stirred to worship the powers that had brought them into being. The theological sophistication of Amun's concealed nature becomes apparent when examining how ancient Egyptian thinkers understood the relationship between visibility and power, between obvious manifestation and lasting influence. In their worldview, shaped by millennia of careful observation of natural and social phenomena, the most obvious manifestations of divine force were often the least significant in the long term. The spectacular sunrise commanded immediate attention, drawing every eye toward the eastern horizon, inspiring awe and wonder in all who witnessed its daily miracle. But the invisible air that made breathing possible was far more essential to continued existence, sustaining life moment by moment without ever demanding recognition or worship. The dramatic thunderstorm demonstrated divine power through lightning and thunder that terrified observers into submission. But the gentle rain that followed, soaking into the soil to nourish crops and fill wells, provided the actual benefits that sustained human civilization. By embodying this principle of hidden significance, Amun positioned himself as a deity whose importance would only grow over time, whose influence would expand as other gods rose and fell, whose power would endure long after more spectacular deities had faded into obscurity. The flashy gods attracted attention in the short term, but Amun's patient, hidden approach built foundations that would support his eventual supremacy over the entire Egyptian pantheon. He was playing a longer game than any other deity, working toward goals that extended beyond the immediate concerns of cosmic politics, building toward a future that only he could fully envision, because only he possessed the hidden wisdom necessary to perceive it. As the primordial epoch drew toward its close, and the foundations of ordered creation began to solidify, Amun's influence started to extend beyond his original domain of hidden air and wind. His ability to work through concealment allowed him to establish connections with other aspects of the emerging cosmos, without triggering territorial disputes with his fellow deities. While other gods jealously guarded their specific domains, fighting to maintain exclusive control over their particular spheres of influence, Amun quietly extended his reach into every corner of existence, establishing hidden connections that would later prove invaluable for coordinating divine activity across the entire cosmic order. This expansion of influence occurred so gradually and subtly that by the time other divine beings recognized what was happening, Amun had already established himself as an indispensable component of the cosmic order. He had become the hidden thread that connected all other aspects of divine reality, the invisible network through which information and influence flowed between different domains of existence, the secret foundation upon which the entire structure of the pantheon ultimately rested. To remove Amun from this position would have required dismantling the very fabric of cosmic organization, a task so enormous and so dangerous that no deity dared attempt it. And so Amun's position, established through patience and subtlety rather than force and confrontation, became permanent, unassailable, eternal. The breath that had first stirred the primordial waters had become the breath that sustained all existence, the hidden force that animated every living thing, the invisible presence that permeated every corner of the cosmos. Amun had achieved through concealment what no amount of obvious power could have accomplished, a position of supreme influence that depended not upon the fear or submission of other beings, but upon their absolute dependence on forces they could not see, could not understand, and could not exist without. The hidden one had become the essential one, and his journey toward ultimate supremacy had only just begun. The gradual expansion of Amun's cosmic influence eventually brought him into contact with other powerful deities who had emerged from different theological traditions across the vast landscape of ancient Egypt. Each region had developed its own understanding of divine reality, its own pantheon of gods and goddesses who embodied local concerns and reflected regional values. As Egypt moved toward political unification, these diverse religious traditions began to interact, creating opportunities for theological innovation that would reshape the entire structure of Egyptian spirituality. Among these encounters between different divine traditions, none would prove more transformative than Amun's meeting with Mut, the fierce vulture goddess whose domain encompassed the protective aspects of divine motherhood. Their union would fundamentally reshape the Egyptian understanding of divine family structures and establish a new model for cosmic authority that would endure for centuries, influencing not only religious thought, but also political organization, social relationships, and individual spiritual practice. Mut's origins traced back to the earliest dynasties of Egyptian civilization, when she served as a protective deity for the royal household and embodied the fierce maternal instincts that could both nurture and destroy. Her name itself meant simply mother, but this simple designation carried depths of meaning that reflected the Egyptian understanding of maternal power as one of the most formidable forces in existence. A mother's love could sustain life through the most difficult circumstances, providing the emotional and physical support necessary for children to survive and thrive. But a mother's wrath, when her children were threatened, could unleash destruction that no enemy could withstand, a protective fury that knew no limits and accepted no compromise. Her iconography depicted her as a woman wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, a visual statement of her authority over the entire unified kingdom that would eventually emerge from the political struggles of the early dynastic period. Sometimes she appeared with the wings of a vulture spread protectively behind her shoulders, creating a canopy of divine protection that sheltered all who sought her favor. The vulture symbolism carried profound significance in Egyptian culture, as these birds were observed to be devoted mothers who would defend their young against any threat, regardless of the size or power of the aggressor. Ancient Egyptians watched vultures circling protectively over their nests, driving away predators many times their size through sheer ferocity and determination, and recognized in this behavior a model for the kind of protective power they sought from their divine mother. This protective ferocity made Mut an ideal counterpart to Amun's hidden influence, as she could provide the visible strength and protection that his concealed nature could not directly offer. Amun worked through subtle channels, influencing events through methods too refined for ordinary perception to detect. But there were situations that required obvious intervention, moments when worshippers needed to see divine power manifesting on their behalf, circumstances that demanded the kind of dramatic protective action that only a visible deity could provide. Mut filled this role perfectly, her fierce maternal presence complementing Amun's hidden wisdom in ways that created a more complete system of divine support than either could offer alone. The circumstances surrounding Amun and Mut's initial encounter reflect the complex theological negotiations that occurred as different regional religious traditions merged during Egypt's political unification. Mut had established herself as the primary goddess of Thebes, the rising political center in Upper Egypt that would eventually challenge the traditional dominance of Memphis and Heliopolis. Her worship centered around her role as divine mother and protector of the pharaoh, making her an essential component of royal legitimacy in the Theban region. Any ruler who sought to control Thebes needed Mut's blessing, needed to be recognized as her protected child, needed to demonstrate that the fierce vulture goddess had accepted him as worthy of her maternal care. When Amun's influence began to manifest more strongly in Thebes, the local priesthood faced the challenge of integrating his mysterious presence with Mut's established authority. This was not a simple matter of adding another god to the local pantheon, of finding room for one more deity among the many already worshipped in the region. Amun's nature as the Hidden One meant that his presence could not be confined to a specific temple or limited to particular ceremonies. His influence permeated everything, touched every aspect of existence, operated through channels that could not be separated from the domains of other deities. How could Mut maintain her position as Thebes' primary goddess when an invisible force was gradually establishing itself as the hidden foundation of all divine activity in the region? The theological solution that emerged from this challenge proved remarkably sophisticated, demonstrating the intellectual creativity that characterized Egyptian religious thought at its best. Rather than positioning Amun and Mut as competing deities vying for supremacy, rather than forcing worshippers to choose between the hidden god and the protective mother, the Theban priests developed a narrative that presented their union as a cosmic necessity. Amun's hidden nature required a visible manifestation of divine power to make his influence comprehensible to mortal worshippers. How could people worship a god they could not see, trust a deity whose actions they could not observe, maintain faith in a power whose very existence remained perpetually ambiguous? Mut provided the answer, her fierce visible presence serving as the tangible expression of Amun's hidden will, her protective actions demonstrating the reality of divine care that Amun's concealed nature could not directly reveal. Simultaneously, Mut's fierce protectiveness needed the subtle wisdom and infinite potential that only a concealed deity could provide. Raw protective power, however formidable, required guidance to be effective. The mother who defended her children needed to know which threats were real and which were illusory, needed to understand the complex web of relationships that determined who was friend and who was foe, needed access to hidden knowledge that would allow her to anticipate dangers before they materialized. Amun provided this wisdom, his concealed observation of all things giving him insight into threats that Mut's visible presence could not detect, his hidden influence shaping circumstances in ways that made her protective interventions more effective. Their marriage thus represented not merely a political alliance between divine beings, not simply a convenient arrangement that served the interests of the Theban priesthood, but a fundamental completion of cosmic forces that had previously existed in isolation. Amun without Mut was wisdom without strength, influence without manifestation, potential without actualization. Mut without Amun was power without direction, protection without foresight, action without the hidden knowledge necessary to ensure that action achieved its intended purposes. Together, they formed a complete system of divine authority that could address every need of their worshippers, that could operate through both visible and invisible channels, that could provide both the obvious protection people craved and the subtle guidance they needed, but could not consciously request. The wedding ceremony between Amun and Mut, as described in the sacred texts that preserve this foundational narrative, occurred during a cosmic alignment that brought together the hidden and visible aspects of divine power in perfect harmony. The timing was not arbitrary but reflected deep understanding of the astronomical cycles that govern the flow of cosmic energy, the moments when different aspects of divine reality could most easily interact and merge. The priests who recorded this event understood that the union of Amun and Mut was not merely a social arrangement between two powerful beings, but a cosmic event that would permanently alter the structure of divine reality, creating new possibilities for the relationship between gods and mortals that had not existed before. Amun approached the ceremony wearing his traditional feathered crown, its twin plumes representing the dual nature of air as both life-giving breath and invisible presence. The feathers seemed to merge with the atmosphere around them, their edges indistinct, their colors shifting between the deep blue of hidden sky and the transparency of wind made barely visible. His skin maintained the deep blue coloration that marked his connection to the hidden depths of the sky, that vast expanse above the earth that appears empty but actually contains the atmosphere that makes all terrestrial life possible. His eyes were described as containing the swirling patterns of wind made visible, depths within depths that suggested infinite knowledge accumulated through eternal observation of all things from perfect concealment. Mut appeared in her full regalia as Queen of the Gods, a title she would hold throughout the long centuries of Theban religious dominance. The double crown of Egypt gleamed upon her head, its white and red components representing her authority over both Upper and Lower Egypt, her role as protector of the unified kingdom that the Theban pharaohs would eventually establish. Her vulture wings created a canopy of protection over the assembled divine witnesses, spreading wide to shelter all who had gathered to observe this momentous union. Her eyes burned with the fierce light of maternal determination, the absolute commitment to protecting those she loved that made her one of the most formidable deities in the entire Egyptian pantheon. The actual union between these two powerful deities generated cosmic reverberations that affected the entire Egyptian pantheon, sending waves of transformed energy throughout the divine realm that forced other gods to adjust their positions and relationships. Amun's hidden influence merged with Mut's visible authority to create a new form of divine power that combined concealment with manifestation, subtlety with strength, wisdom with action. This merger established them as the supreme divine couple, whose authority derived not from conquest or inheritance, not from the defeat of rivals or the accumulation of worshippers, but from their perfect complementary nature, their ability to provide together what neither could offer alone. The theological implications of this union extended far beyond their personal relationship, providing a new model for understanding how divine power could operate through both hidden and visible channels simultaneously. Previous Egyptian theology had generally assumed that gods operated either through obvious manifestation or through hidden influence, that these two modes of divine action were alternatives rather than complements. Amun and Mut's marriage demonstrated that the most effective divine authority combined both approaches, using visible action to address immediate needs while hidden influence shaped the broader context within which those actions occurred. This insight would later influence Egyptian concepts of political leadership, suggesting that effective rulers needed to combine public displays of power with private networks of influence, obvious authority with hidden wisdom. The cosmic wedding produced immediate effects throughout the divine realm, as other deities found themselves drawn into new relationships and alliances that reflected the shifted balance of power. Ra, the sun god whose visible journey across the sky had previously made him the most recognizable divine figure in Egypt, discovered that his solar authority now operated within the broader framework of Amun and Mut's combined influence. His daily journey continued as before. His light still illuminated the world and sustained life, but the context within which this journey occurred had fundamentally changed. Ra was no longer the supreme manifestation of divine power, but rather one important component within a larger system, coordinated by the hidden wisdom of Amun and protected by the fierce vigilance of Mut. Pa, the creator deity of Memphis, whose craftsman's skills had shaped the physical forms of the cosmos, found that his creative abilities were increasingly called upon to create physical manifestations of Amun's hidden concepts under Mut's protective oversight. The divine craftsman had always worked according to plans and purposes that originated beyond his own consciousness, shaping matter according to patterns that reflected deeper cosmic intentions. Now those intentions were more clearly identified with Amun's hidden will, and the protection that allowed Ptah to work without interference came explicitly from Mut's maternal vigilance. The great creator god had become, in effect, an employee of the Theban divine couple, his remarkable abilities serving their purposes rather than operating independently. The establishment of Amun and Mut as the supreme divine couple coincided with significant political developments in Egypt itself, creating a resonance between divine and human affairs that strengthened both religious and political authority. The Theban rulers, who would eventually found the Middle Kingdom, found in this divine marriage a perfect reflection of their own aspirations for unified authority over the entire Nile Valley. The pharaohs could identify with Amun's hidden wisdom and strategic thinking, seeing in the concealed god a model for the kind of subtle political maneuvering that successful rule required. Simultaneously, they could draw upon Mut's fierce protective power to legitimize their rule over both Upper and Lower Egypt, presenting themselves as children of the Divine Mother, whose authority extended over the entire unified kingdom. This political resonance ensured that the divine marriage would receive extensive royal patronage and theological development, as successive pharaohs invested enormous resources in elaborating the mythology and ritual practices associated with Amun and Mut's union. The temples built to honor this divine couple became the largest and most magnificent religious structures in Egypt, their construction projects employing thousands of workers and consuming vast quantities of precious materials. The priesthoods that served these temples grew into powerful institutions whose influence extended far beyond purely religious matters, shaping political decisions, economic policies, and social relationships throughout the kingdom. The birth of Khonsu represented the natural culmination of Amun and Mut's union, the divine child who would complete the Theban triad and establish the model for sacred family structure that would influence Egyptian thought for millennia. The conception occurred during a lunar eclipse, when the hidden aspects of the sky temporarily obscured the moon's visible light, creating a moment of cosmic alignment that perfectly reflected the union of hidden and visible divine powers. Amun's invisible breath merged with Mut's protective embrace to create a divine child who would embody both concealment and revelation, hiddenness and cyclical visibility, the subtle wisdom of his father and the fierce protection of his mother. The pregnancy lasted exactly 1 lunar year, 13 complete cycles of the moon from new to full and back again, during which Mut's protective instincts intensified to encompass not only her unborn child, but the entire cosmic order that would be affected by his eventual birth. The Divine Mother understood that she was carrying not merely another god, but a new principle of cosmic organization, a being whose nature would introduce cyclical renewal into a universe that had previously known only the eternal stasis of primordial existence or the linear progression of created time. Khonsu would bring something genuinely new into existence, and Mut's maternal vigilance ensured that this new thing would emerge safely into a cosmos prepared to receive it. Khonsu emerged into divine existence during the new moon, when the sky appeared darkest but held the greatest potential for renewal, when the absence of visible lunar light created space for new illumination to emerge. His first cry echoed across the heavens as a sound that could only be heard by those who understood the language of hidden things, a voice that spoke simultaneously of concealment and revelation, of darkness that contained light, of endings that were also beginnings. Yet the effects of this cry were visible in the immediate appearance of the crescent moon, the first sliver of renewed light that announced the beginning of a new lunar cycle and demonstrated that Khonsu's hidden voice could produce visible results. The newborn god displayed characteristics inherited from both parents, while introducing entirely new divine attributes that neither possessed alone. From Amun, He inherited the ability to work through concealment, to influence events through subtle channels that ordinary perception could not detect. From Mut, he received fierce protective instincts that would make him a guardian of travelers and a healer of the sick. But Khonsu's unique contribution to the divine family lay in his mastery over time itself, his lunar phases providing the cosmic rhythm by which all other temporal cycles would be measured. The moon's regular progression from new to full and back again established the basic unit of time that humans would use to organize their lives, to plan their activities, to mark the passage of their existence through the mysterious medium of duration. The infant Khonsu's appearance combined elements from both parents, while introducing entirely new divine characteristics that reflected his unique role within the cosmic order. His skin shifted between the silver white of moonlight and the deep blue inherited from his father, creating a visual representation of the moon's phases through his very complexion. When the moon was full, Khonsu's skin glowed with brilliant silver radiance that illuminated the night and provided guidance for travelers. When the moon was new, his skin darkened to the deep blue of hidden sky, connecting him to his father's concealed nature and the mysteries that could only be accessed during the darkest nights. Upon his head rested a lunar disk that waxed and waned in perfect synchronization with the actual moon visible in the earthly sky, a crown that was not merely symbolic, but actually functional, demonstrating the intimate connection between the god and the celestial body he controlled. His eyes held the gentle light of the crescent moon, offering illumination without the harsh brightness that might blind those who gazed upon him, providing guidance without overwhelming the darkness that was equally necessary for cosmic balance. Unlike his parents' more static appearances, Khonsu's form constantly evolved, reflecting the eternal cycle of lunar transformation that was his essential nature and his gift to the cosmos. The young moon god's early adventures established him as a deity of healing and protection, particularly for those who traveled during nighttime hours, when his light provided the only illumination in a world without artificial lighting. His first significant act involved healing a young prince who had been struck by a mysterious illness that no earthly physician could cure, a disease that seemed to drain the vital force from its victim without producing any symptoms that medical knowledge could address. Khonsu descended from the divine realm during the full moon. When his healing powers reached their peak intensity, his silver light carrying restorative energy that could penetrate to the deepest levels of physical and spiritual existence. He placed his hands upon the prince's fevered brow, and the lunar light that flowed from his fingers drew out the sickness like a gentle tide, removing impurities from the shore. The illness, which had resisted every treatment that human healers could devise, dissolved before Khonsu's touch, its dark energy dispersing into the night air where it could no longer harm anyone. The prince's recovery was immediate and complete, his strength returning as the moon's light filled his body with renewed vitality. This healing established Khonsu's reputation as a compassionate deity who could bridge the gap between the divine realm and mortal suffering, who cared enough about human welfare to descend from his celestial position and provide direct assistance to those in need. The lunar god's adventures often involved traveling to distant lands where his healing powers were desperately needed, journeys that took him far beyond the borders of Egypt, into regions where his father's hidden influence and his mother's protective authority had not yet been established. One particularly significant journey took him to Nubia, where a plague had devastated several communities along the Nile, killing thousands and threatening to spread into Egypt itself. Khonsu's approach was heralded by the appearance of an unusually bright full moon that remained visible even during daylight hours, a cosmic sign that announced the arrival of divine assistance and gave hope to populations that had begun to despair of survival. He worked methodically through the affected regions, his lunar light purifying contaminated water sources and strengthening the immune systems of those who had been exposed to the disease. Where he walked, the plague retreated. Where his light fell, health returned. The grateful Nubian communities established shrines in his honor, creating the first international recognition of the Theban triad's power beyond Egypt's traditional borders. These shrines would later serve as outposts for the expansion of Amun's influence into foreign territories, demonstrating how Khonsu's healing missions serve not only humanitarian purposes, but also the broader strategic goals of his father's hidden agenda. Another adventure saw Khonsu confronting a group of demons who had been disrupting the natural order by preventing the moon from completing its regular phases. These malevolent entities sought to trap the lunar cycle in perpetual darkness, believing that this would weaken the divine authority of the Theban triad by eliminating the visible manifestation of their power that Khonsu's monthly journey provided. If the moon never rose, if the night remained forever dark, then Khonsu's influence would be eliminated, and with it, the cyclical renewal that his presence brought to the cosmic order. Khonsu engaged these demons in a battle that lasted 28 days, corresponding to a complete lunar month, each night manifesting a different aspect of his power as the moon progressed through its phases. During the new moon, he fought with the subtle influence inherited from his father, working through hidden channels to undermine the demons' coordination and sow confusion among their ranks. As the moon waxed toward fullness, his attacks became increasingly visible and powerful, culminating in the overwhelming radiance of the full moon that drove the demons back and broke their hold on the lunar cycle. As the moon waned, he pursued the retreating enemies, using the decreasing light to track them into the darkest corners of existence where they sought to hide. The demons found themselves unable to adapt to his constantly changing tactics, unable to develop defenses against an opponent whose nature shifted from night to night, whose power waxed and waned according to rhythms they could not predict or control. They were ultimately banished to the furthest reaches of the cosmic void, cast out of the ordered universe into regions of pure chaos where they could no longer threaten the regular progression of celestial cycles. This victory established Khonsu as a warrior god as well as a healer, demonstrating that the gentle light of the moon could become a weapon of devastating power when cosmic order was threatened. The family dynamics within the Theban triad established patterns that would influence Egyptian concepts of divine and royal authority for centuries, providing models for how power should be organized and exercised at every level of society. Amun's role as the hidden father provided strategic wisdom and long-term planning, his influence operating through subtle guidance rather than direct command. He did not tell his wife and son what to do, did not issue orders that demanded immediate obedience, did not exercise the kind of obvious authority that lesser beings might recognize and resent. Instead, he shaped the context within which they operated, provided information that guided their decisions, created circumstances that made certain choices more attractive than others. Mut's position as the Divine Mother combined fierce protection with practical administration, ensuring that the family's interests were defended while daily operations proceeded smoothly. She was the visible face of Theban divine authority, the one who appeared when worshippers needed to see divine power manifesting on their behalf, the one who took action when threats required immediate response. Her protective instincts extended not only to her husband and son, but to all who sought shelter under her wings, all who acknowledged the Theban triad's authority and requested their assistance. Khonsu's function as the divine child brought renewal and healing, his cyclical nature ensuring that the family's power would continue to regenerate rather than stagnating in fixed patterns. Every month, As the moon completed its journey from new to full and back again, Khonsu demonstrated that divine power was not static but dynamic, not fixed but flowing, not permanent but perpetually renewed. This cyclical renewal prevented the kind of stagnation that had afflicted other divine families, whose power gradually diminished as the initial energy of their establishment dissipated over time. The interactions between these three deities created a complex web of relationships that served as a model for both divine and mortal families throughout Egypt. Amun's conversations with Khonsu typically occurred during the new moon, when the young god's receptivity to hidden wisdom reached its peak, when the absence of visible lunar light created space for subtle communication that would have been overwhelmed by brighter illumination. During these private consultations, the father would share cosmic secrets and strategic insights that would guide Khonsu's actions during his visible phases, providing the hidden knowledge that would make his healing missions more effective and his protective interventions more precisely targeted. Mut's relationship with her son was more direct and emotionally expressive, her protective instincts ensuring that Khonsu never ventured into situations beyond his capabilities, while still allowing him the freedom necessary for growth and learning. She watched over his adventures with the fierce vigilance that characterized all her actions, ready to intervene if threats exceeded what he could handle alone, but restraining herself from unnecessary interference that might prevent him from developing his own strength and wisdom. This balance between protection and freedom became a model for Egyptian concepts of proper parenting, suggesting that good mothers provided security without smothering, guidance without control, love without possession. The theological implications of the Theban triad's family structure extended into practical governance and social organization, as Egyptian royal families began modeling their own relationships on the divine pattern established by Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. The pharaoh represented the hidden wisdom of Amun, working through strategic planning and subtle influence to maintain order throughout the kingdom, making decisions based on information that ordinary subjects could not access, pursuing goals that extended beyond the immediate concerns of daily governance. The queen embodied Mut's protective ferocity, serving as the visible defender of royal authority and the fierce guardian of the dynasty's interests, taking action when threats required immediate response, providing the obvious manifestation of power that subjects needed to see. The crown prince filled Khonsu's role as the source of renewal and healing, traveling throughout the kingdom to address local problems and demonstrate the royal family's continuing vitality, showing that the dynasty's power was not static but dynamic, not fixed but flowing, not permanent but perpetually renewed through the energy of the younger generation. This divine family model provided a template for understanding how authority should be organized at every level of Egyptian society, from the cosmic governance of the gods to the political administration of the kingdom to the domestic management of individual households. The establishment of the Theban triad as the supreme divine family marked a fundamental shift in Egyptian religious thought, moving away from the earlier emphasis on individual deities operating in isolation toward a more integrated understanding of divine power as a collaborative enterprise. This theological evolution would prove essential to Egypt's political and cultural development, providing the religious foundation for the unified kingdom that would emerge during the Middle Kingdom period and reach its greatest extent during the New Kingdom that followed. The hidden god, the protective mother, and the healing son had become the model for all legitimate authority, the pattern that all who sought power needed to emulate, the standard against which all claims to leadership would be measured. The political landscape of Egypt underwent dramatic transformation during the early New Kingdom period, as the Theban pharaohs successfully expelled the Hyksos invaders and reasserted native Egyptian control over the entire Nile Valley. This military triumph, achieved after generations of foreign domination and national humiliation, created unprecedented opportunities for theological innovation, as the victorious rulers sought to establish religious frameworks that would legitimize their expanded authority and reflect their newfound imperial ambitions. The established Theban triad of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu had already demonstrated their effectiveness in supporting royal power during the liberation struggle, their worship providing the spiritual foundation for the military campaigns that had driven the foreigners from Egyptian soil. But the scope of Egypt's new dominion required divine authority that could match the pharaoh's expanded territorial reach, that could provide religious legitimacy for rule over foreign peoples who possessed their own gods and their own understanding of cosmic order. The sun god Ra had maintained his position as one of Egypt's most powerful deities since the earliest dynastic periods, his daily journey across the sky serving as the most visible manifestation of divine order in the natural world. Every morning, without fail, the sun rose in the east, climbed to its zenith at noon, and descended toward the western horizon as evening approached. This reliable progression provided the most obvious evidence of divine activity that any observer could witness, a daily miracle that required no faith to perceive, no special knowledge to understand, no priestly interpretation to appreciate. Ra's worship, centered in Heliopolis near the apex of the Nile Delta, had produced sophisticated theological concepts about solar supremacy and cosmic kingship that had influenced Egyptian religious thought for over a millennium, establishing frameworks for understanding divine authority that remained influential even as political power shifted southward to Thebes. However, Ra's traditional association with the northern regions and the old capital of Memphis created political complications for the Theban rulers who now controlled the entire kingdom. The solar god's priesthood had supported the Hyksos during their occupation of Lower Egypt, or at least had failed to resist foreign rule with the vigor that Theban patriots considered appropriate. This collaboration, whether active or passive, had tainted Ra's worship with associations of foreign domination and national betrayal that made simple adoption of solar theology politically problematic. The Theban pharaohs needed Ra's established authority and universal recognition, but they could not simply subordinate themselves to a deity whose priesthood had accommodated foreign rule. The challenge facing the new kingdom pharaohs and their priestly advisors was finding a way to incorporate Ra's established solar authority into the Theban religious framework without diminishing their own divine patron's supreme position. This was not merely a matter of political convenience or theological tidiness, but a fundamental question about the nature of divine power and its relationship to human authority. If Amun was truly the supreme god, the hidden source of all cosmic power, then how could Ra's obvious solar authority be explained? If Ra's daily journey demonstrated his supreme position among the gods, then what role remained for Amun's concealed influence? These questions required answers that would satisfy both theological consistency and political necessity, that would honor the genuine insights of both religious traditions while establishing clear hierarchies of divine authority. The theological negotiations that led to the fusion of Amun and Ra represented one of the most sophisticated religious innovations in ancient Egyptian history, a creative synthesis that resolved apparent contradictions by revealing deeper complementarities. Rather than attempting to subordinate one deity to the other through conquest or absorption, rather than declaring one tradition true and the other false, the Theban priests developed a revolutionary concept that presented the two gods as complementary aspects of a single supreme divine entity. This approach recognized that Amun's hidden nature and Ra's visible solar journey each represented essential components of complete cosmic authority. that neither alone could provide the full range of divine functions that effective rule over the cosmos required. The fusion would create a deity who possessed both the subtle strategic wisdom of concealed power and the obvious legitimacy that came from visible daily manifestation. Amun-Ra would be simultaneously hidden and revealed, working through invisible channels, while also demonstrating his power through the most spectacular natural phenomenon observable from Earth. This combination addressed the limitations that each deity faced when operating alone. Amun's hiddenness, while providing immunity from opposition and unlimited flexibility of action, also created problems of recognition and worship. How could people maintain devotion to a god they could never see, whose actions they could never directly observe, whose very existence remained perpetually ambiguous? Ra's visibility, while providing undeniable evidence of divine power, also created vulnerabilities. A god whose actions could be observed, could also be predicted, could be opposed, could be challenged by those who understood his patterns and limitations. The actual process of theological merger occurred gradually over several generations of new kingdom rulers, with each pharaoh contributing additional elements to the evolving concept of Amun-Ra. The initial stages focused on establishing doctrinal compatibility between the two deities' existing attributes and spheres of influence, demonstrating that apparent differences actually reflected complementary aspects of a single divine reality. Amun's role as the hidden breath of life found natural correspondence with Ra's function as the life-giving solar energy that sustained all existence. The invisible air that Amun controlled provided the medium through which Ra's visible light could travel and exert its influence upon the world. Without air, light could not reach the Earth's surface, could not warm the soil and stimulate plant growth, could not provide the energy that powered all biological processes. The complementary relationship between hidden air and visible light formed the foundation for more complex theological developments that would follow. The fusion gained momentum during the reign of Hatshepsut, whose unique position as a female pharaoh required particularly sophisticated religious justification. Traditional Egyptian concepts of kingship had been developed for male rulers, creating theological frameworks that assumed masculine divine authority and masculine human leadership. Hatshepsut's claim to the throne challenged these assumptions, requiring new theological arguments that could legitimate female rule without completely overturning established religious traditions. Her architects and theologians developed elaborate ceremonial protocols that demonstrated how Amun-Ra's dual nature provided precedent for her own combination of traditionally masculine royal authority with feminine divine wisdom. The great obelisks she erected at Karnak bore inscriptions describing how Amun-Ra had personally selected her for rulership, his hidden wisdom recognizing her capabilities, while his solar authority provided visible confirmation of her legitimacy. These monuments, towering shafts of granite capped with gold that caught the first rays of the rising sun, established visual representations of the fused deity that would influence artistic depictions for centuries to come. The obelisks themselves embodied the fusion of hidden and visible divine power, their massive stone bodies representing the solid, enduring, hidden foundation of divine authority, while their golden tips blazed with solar radiance that could be seen for miles, announcing the presence of divine power to all who beheld them. The iconographic development of Amun-Ra required careful integration of both deities' traditional visual elements, while creating new symbolic representations of their combined authority. The fused god retained Amun's distinctive feathered crown, its twin plumes representing the dual nature of air as both life-giving breath and invisible presence. But the plumes now incorporated golden solar discs that reflected Ra's luminous nature, creating a crown that simultaneously evoked hidden wind and visible sunlight. His skin maintained the deep blue coloration associated with Amun's connection to hidden air, but it now possessed a subtle golden undertone that suggested the presence of solar energy flowing beneath the surface, as if the sun's light had been absorbed into his very flesh and radiated outward through channels too subtle for ordinary perception to detect. The most striking innovation was the development of composite eyes that appeared to shift between the swirling patterns of wind and the blazing intensity of solar fire, depending upon the viewer's perspective and the lighting conditions under which the image was observed. Artists developed techniques for creating this effect, using carefully positioned inlays of different colored stones, arranging lapis lazuli and gold leaf in patterns that caught light differently as observers moved around the statue or as the sun's angle changed throughout the day. These shifting eyes became one of the most recognizable features of Amun-Ra's iconography, visual demonstrations of his dual nature that could be experienced directly by anyone who took the time to observe his images carefully. The theological implications of this visual fusion extended far beyond mere artistic representation, challenging fundamental assumptions about divine nature that had previously seemed unquestionable. The composite iconography demonstrated that Amun-Ra possessed the ability to manifest both hidden and visible aspects of divine power simultaneously, rather than alternating between concealment and revelation, as previous theological frameworks had assumed. This concept challenged traditional Egyptian understanding of divine nature, which had previously assumed that gods must choose between operating through hidden influence or visible manifestation, that these two modes of divine action were alternatives rather than complements. The revolutionary idea that a single deity could embody both modes of existence simultaneously positioned Amun-Ra as a fundamentally different type of divine being, one whose authority transcended the limitations that constrained other gods. While other deities were bound by the logic of either or, forced to choose between visibility and concealment, between obvious power and subtle influence, Amun-Ra operated according to the logic of both, and combining apparent opposites in ways that multiplied rather than limited his capabilities. This theological innovation would later influence philosophical concepts far beyond Egypt, contributing to the development of dialectical thinking that recognized how apparent contradictions could be resolved through synthesis at higher levels of understanding. The political circumstances that facilitated this theological innovation reflected the broader imperial ambitions of New Kingdom Egypt, the drive to establish Egyptian authority over territories that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of the Nile Valley. The pharaohs who ruled during this period controlled territories that extended from Nubia in the south to the Levant in the north, creating administrative challenges that required new forms of religious legitimization. Local populations throughout this expanded empire possessed their own established relationships with solar deities, their own traditions of sun worship that had developed independently of Egyptian influence, making Ra's incorporation into the supreme Theban god particularly valuable for maintaining religious continuity across diverse cultural regions. Simultaneously, Amun's hidden nature allowed the fused deity to work through local religious traditions without requiring their complete replacement. Foreign peoples could continue worshipping their traditional solar gods, while gradually coming to understand these gods as local manifestations of Amun-Ra's universal authority. This theological flexibility proved crucial for maintaining religious stability throughout the diverse territories that comprised the Egyptian empire during its greatest extent, allowing imperial administrators to accommodate local religious practices while still asserting the ultimate supremacy of Egyptian divine authority. The fusion process accelerated significantly during the reign of Thutmose III, whose military campaigns established Egypt as the dominant power throughout the eastern Mediterranean. His victories required religious explanations that could account for Egyptian supremacy over foreign peoples who possessed their own powerful gods and sophisticated theological systems. How could Egyptian armies consistently defeat enemies who prayed to their own deities for protection and victory? The concept of Amun-Ra as a deity who combined hidden strategic wisdom with visible solar authority provided the perfect framework for understanding Egyptian imperial success. The god's concealed nature explained how Egyptian forces could achieve surprise victories through superior planning and intelligence gathering, how they could anticipate enemy movements and exploit weaknesses that their opponents had not recognized. Amun's hidden wisdom provided the strategic insight that guided military planning, the intelligence about enemy dispositions and intentions that allowed Egyptian commanders to make decisions based on information their opponents did not possess. Simultaneously, Ra's solar aspect demonstrated the obvious divine favor that blessed Egyptian arms with consistent triumph, the visible manifestation of divine support that inspired Egyptian soldiers and demoralized their enemies. The military applications of Amun-Ra's dual nature became particularly evident during the famous Battle of Megiddo, where Thutmose III employed innovative tactical strategies that caught his enemies completely off guard. The official accounts of this campaign, carved into the walls of Karnak for all future generations to read, described how Amun-Ra had provided the pharaoh with hidden knowledge of enemy positions and intentions, while simultaneously manifesting his solar power through favorable weather conditions that aided Egyptian forces. The combination of concealed intelligence and visible divine intervention became the standard explanation for Egyptian military success throughout the imperial period, a theological framework that made sense of victories that might otherwise have seemed merely fortunate. The theological sophistication of the Amun-Ra fusion reached its peak during the development of creation myths that incorporated both deities' cosmological roles, narratives that explained how the supreme god had initiated creation through a process that combined hidden planning with visible execution. These new creation accounts did not simply replace earlier myths, but rather reinterpreted them, revealing deeper meanings that had always been present but had not been fully understood until the fusion of Amun and Ra made them apparent. In the beginning, according to these revised narratives, Amun-Ra existed in a state of perfect concealment within the primordial waters, his presence undetectable even to other primordial forces. During this hidden phase, he developed the complete plan for cosmic creation, working out every detail of the ordered universe that would eventually emerge from chaos. This planning process required the kind of comprehensive knowledge that only a hidden observer could possess, the ability to perceive all possibilities and calculate all consequences without being limited by the partial perspectives that characterized other divine beings. When the moment for active creation arrived, Amun-Ra began to manifest his solar aspect, his hidden light gradually increasing in intensity until it became visible as the first sunrise. This initial dawn represented not merely the appearance of the sun, but the revelation of the cosmic plan that had been developing in concealment since the beginning of time. The light that emerged carried within it the complete blueprint for creation, each ray containing the information necessary to generate and sustain specific aspects of the ordered universe. The sun did not merely illuminate a pre-existing world, but actually created that world through the information encoded in its light, bringing into existence everything that the hidden planning phase had designed. This creation myth positioned Amun-Ra as both the architect who designed creation in secret and the craftsman who executed the plan through visible solar energy. The hidden and visible aspects of his nature were not sequential phases that replaced each other, but simultaneous dimensions of a single creative act that could only be fully understood when both aspects were recognized. Creation was not first planned and then executed, but planned and executed simultaneously, the hidden design and the visible manifestation emerging together as complementary aspects of a single divine action. The fusion also required careful integration of the two deities' existing relationships with other gods throughout the Egyptian pantheon, creating complex theological relationships that reflected the new supreme deity's expanded authority. Ra's traditional associations with the Heliopolitan Ennead, the 9 gods who had emerged from the primordial creator, according to the theology of Heliopolis, needed to be reconciled with Amun's position as head of the Theban triad. The solution involved elevating Amun-Ra to a position that transcended traditional pantheon structures, making him the source from which all other divine authority ultimately derived. This elevation established him as the king of the gods, a title that reflected his supreme position while acknowledging the continued existence and importance of other deities within the cosmic hierarchy. Amun-Ra did not replace other gods, but rather provided the hidden foundation upon which their visible authority rested, the concealed source from which their manifest powers flowed. Other deities continued to perform their traditional functions, continued to receive worship and provide assistance to their devotees, but they did so as expressions of Amun-Ra's comprehensive divine will, rather than as independent agents pursuing their own purposes. The practical implications of Amun-Ra's supreme authority manifested in the reorganization of priestly hierarchies throughout Egypt, as religious institutions adjusted to reflect the new theological reality. The high priest of Amun-Ra at Karnak became the most powerful religious figure in the kingdom, with authority that extended over local priesthoods dedicated to other deities. This centralization of religious authority paralleled the political centralization that characterized New Kingdom administration, creating a unified system of control that operated through both visible governmental structures and hidden religious influence. The priests of Amun-Ra developed sophisticated networks of communication and coordination that allowed them to monitor and influence religious practices throughout the empire, ensuring that local variations in worship remained within acceptable bounds, while still accommodating the diversity necessary for maintaining stability across culturally diverse territories. These networks operated largely through hidden channels, their activities invisible to ordinary observers, but profoundly influential in shaping the religious landscape of the ancient world. The economic implications of the fusion proved equally significant, as the combined resources previously dedicated to separate Amun and Ra worship were consolidated under the unified priesthood of Amun-Ra. The enormous temple complex at Karnak became the focal point for this consolidated wealth, with tribute and donations flowing in from throughout the empire to support the supreme deity's worship. The scale of these resources allowed for unprecedented architectural projects that demonstrated Amun-Ra's supreme authority through visible monuments of extraordinary grandeur and sophistication, structures that still inspire awe in visitors more than 3,000 years after their construction. The international dimensions of Amun-Ra's authority became particularly important as Egypt's imperial reach expanded into regions with their own established solar deities. The fused god's dual nature allowed for flexible theological negotiations with foreign populations, as his hidden aspect could work through local religious traditions, while his solar manifestation provided familiar points of connection with indigenous sun worship. This adaptability proved crucial for maintaining religious stability throughout the diverse territories that comprised the Egyptian empire during its greatest extent, allowing imperial administrators to present Egyptian rule as the fulfillment rather than the replacement of local religious aspirations. The theological concept of Amun-Ra, as simultaneously hidden and visible, also influenced Egyptian understanding of royal authority and its relationship to divine power. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom developed increasingly sophisticated presentations of their own dual nature, appearing as visible manifestations of divine authority while claiming access to hidden wisdom that justified their political decisions. This royal theology reached its most elaborate expression during the reign of Amenhotep III, whose court ceremonies regularly demonstrated the king's ability to channel both aspects of Amun-Ra's supreme authority, presenting the pharaoh as a living embodiment of the fusion between concealment and revelation that characterized the supreme god himself. The sun had merged with the shadow, the visible with the hidden, the obvious with the subtle. Amun-Ra stood supreme over all creation, his authority unchallenged, his power unlimited, his wisdom infinite. The theological achievement of the New Kingdom priests had created a divine being capable of addressing every need, answering every prayer, providing every form of assistance that human beings might require. The hidden god of Thebes had absorbed the solar glory of Heliopolis, and in that absorption had become something greater than either tradition alone could have produced. The king of the gods had taken his throne, and his reign would endure for centuries to come. The consolidation of Amun-Ra's supreme authority created unprecedented opportunities for the pharaohs of the New Kingdom to establish their own legitimacy through direct divine association, transforming the nature of Egyptian kingship from mere political authority into sacred institution, blessed by the supreme deity himself. The theological framework that had emerged from the fusion provided Egyptian rulers with access to both the hidden strategic wisdom of Amun and the visible solar authority of Ra, creating a foundation for royal power that transcended traditional political limitations and elevated the pharaoh to a position of cosmic significance that no previous ruler had claimed with such theological sophistication. This divine connection required elaborate doctrinal developments that would transform Egyptian concepts of kingship from mere earthly authority into sacred institution, blessed by the supreme deity himself. The doctrine of divine kingship that emerged during this period positioned the pharaoh as Amun-Ra's chosen representative on earth, selected through mysterious processes that combined hidden divine wisdom with visible manifestations of approval. According to these teachings, every legitimate pharaoh underwent a spiritual adoption ceremony in the divine realm, where Amun-Ra personally examined the candidate's worthiness and granted the divine essence necessary for effective rule. This adoption was not merely symbolic, not simply a ritual acknowledgement of political reality, but involved an actual transformation of the future ruler's spiritual nature, imbuing them with a portion of the supreme deity's dual authority. The pharaoh who emerged from this divine adoption was no longer merely human, no longer simply a mortal who happened to occupy a position of political power. He had become something fundamentally different, a being who existed simultaneously in the human and divine realms, who possessed access to hidden knowledge that ordinary mortals could never attain, who served as the living bridge between the cosmic order maintained by the gods and the social order that governed human affairs. The theological mechanics of this divine selection process drew heavily upon Amun's traditional association with hidden knowledge and strategic planning, presenting the choice of each pharaoh as the culmination of extended divine observation and evaluation. The supreme deity was believed to observe potential rulers from concealment, studying their character, capabilities, and spiritual development over extended periods before making his selection. This hidden evaluation period could last for years or even decades, during which Amun-Ra would test candidates through various challenges and opportunities designed to reveal their true nature. These tests were not obvious examinations that candidates could prepare for or manipulate, but rather the ordinary circumstances of life interpreted as divine trials. How did a potential ruler respond to unexpected setbacks? Did he maintain composure and seek constructive solutions, or did he succumb to anger and blame others for his difficulties? How did he treat those who possess less power than himself? Did he show compassion and justice, or did he exploit his advantages for personal gain? How did he handle success? Did he remain humble and grateful, or did he become arrogant and dismissive of those who had helped him achieve his position? Only those who demonstrated the proper combination of wisdom, strength, and devotion would receive the divine call to rulership. This theological framework served multiple purposes simultaneously. It legitimized the authority of reigning pharaohs by presenting their rule as the result of divine selection rather than mere political circumstance. It provided criteria for evaluating potential successors, giving the priesthood influence over succession decisions by claiming the ability to interpret signs of divine favor. And it created expectations for royal behavior, suggesting that pharaohs who failed to maintain the qualities that had led to their selection might lose divine support and face challenges to their authority. The legendary account of Thutmose. The first selection illustrates the sophisticated nature of these divine choosing narratives, demonstrating how theological concepts were woven into historical accounts to create compelling stories of divine intervention in human affairs. According to the official records carved into the walls of Karnak, the future pharaoh was serving as a military commander in Nubia when Amun-Ra first took notice of his exceptional qualities. The deity observed from concealment as Thutmose demonstrated strategic brilliance during a complex campaign against rebellious tribes, his tactical decisions reflecting the kind of hidden wisdom that marked him as a potential vessel for divine authority. The young commander's ability to anticipate enemy movements and devise innovative solutions to logistical challenges suggested that he already possessed some connection to Amun's concealed knowledge, some intuitive access to information that ordinary commanders could not obtain through conventional means. His troops achieved victories that seemed impossible given their numerical disadvantage and the difficulty of the terrain. Successes that could only be explained by assuming divine assistance that guided the commander's decisions and protected his forces from harm. The actual moment of divine selection occurred during a solar eclipse, when the hidden and visible aspects of Amun-Ra's nature aligned in perfect cosmic harmony. Thutmose was conducting a religious ceremony at a frontier shrine when the eclipse began, the gradual darkening of the sun creating an atmosphere of profound cosmic significance that would forever alter the course of Egyptian history. As the moon's shadow crept across the solar disk, the assembled priests fell silent, their ritual chants dying in their throats as they witnessed what they believed to be the momentary triumph of chaos over order. But Thutmose did not falter. Standing before the shrine's modest altar, he continued his invocations with unwavering voice, his words rising into the darkening sky like incense smoke seeking the heavens. The eclipse reached totality, and in that moment of absolute darkness at midday, witnesses would later report that a corona of golden light surrounded the young prince. Not the sun's corona visible during eclipse, but something else entirely, a radiance that seemed to emanate from Thutmose himself. The priests present recorded that Amun's voice spoke directly into Thutmose's consciousness during those minutes of darkness, revealing secrets of kingship that had been hidden since the first dawn. The god showed him visions of Egypt's future glory, of temples that would rise like mountains from the desert floor, of armies that would carry Egyptian standards to the edges of the known world. But more importantly, Amun revealed the true nature of divine kingship, not merely political authority sanctioned by heaven, but actual participation in the divine essence, a sharing of the god's own hidden nature with his chosen vessel on earth. When the eclipse ended and sunlight flooded back across the land, Thutmose emerged transformed. Those who had known him before spoke of a change in his bearing, a new depth in his eyes that seemed to reflect distances far beyond the physical horizon. He returned to Thebes not as a minor prince seeking advancement, but as a man who had touched the infinite and carried its mark upon his soul. The high priests of Amun, upon examining him, declared that the god's Ka, his spiritual essence, had merged with that of the prince, creating a being who existed simultaneously in the mortal and divine realms. This theological innovation would have profound implications for Egyptian civilization. Previous pharaohs had been considered gods upon their deaths when they joined Osiris in the afterlife and became one with the eternal cycles of death and rebirth. But the Amun theology proposed something far more radical. The living pharaoh was already divine, already a manifestation of the hidden god walking among mortals. This was not mere political propaganda, though it certainly served political purposes. It was a genuine theological development that reflected the unique nature of Amun himself, the god who was simultaneously transcendent and immanent, hidden and revealed, cosmic and intimate. The coronation of Thutmose, the third incorporated rituals that had never before been performed, ceremonies designed to publicly acknowledge and celebrate the divine selection that had already occurred during the eclipse. In the innermost sanctuary of Karnak, the new pharaoh underwent a mystical marriage with Amun, a union that transcended gender and physicality to represent the complete merging of human and divine consciousness. The priests who witnessed this ceremony and their accounts were preserved in texts that would influence Egyptian religion for centuries, described seeing Thutmose's form shimmer and shift, momentarily revealing the ram-headed aspect of Amun before resolving back into human appearance. The temple complex of Karnak stands as humanity's most ambitious attempt to create a physical dwelling place for the infinite. Spanning over 200 acres of sacred ground, its construction consumed the resources and devotion of countless generations, each pharaoh adding to its magnificence as proof of their special relationship with Amun. But Karnak was never merely a building project or a display of royal wealth. It was a cosmic machine, a carefully calibrated instrument designed to facilitate communication between the mortal and divine realms, its every stone placed according to principles that reflected the hidden order underlying all existence. The temple's orientation was determined by astronomical observations conducted over decades, aligning its primary axis with the winter solstice sunrise, so that once each year, the first rays of the reborn sun would penetrate the entire length of the temple, illuminating the innermost sanctuary where Amun's cult statue resided. This annual event was not merely symbolic. The priests believed that the solstice light carried Amun-Ra's vital essence directly into the heart of his earthly dwelling, renewing the divine presence and ensuring the continuation of cosmic order for another year. The precision required for this alignment was extraordinary, demanding mathematical and astronomical knowledge that modern scholars are still working to fully understand. But the solstice alignment was only the most obvious of Karnak's cosmic correspondences. The temple's architects incorporated sacred geometry at every level, from the proportions of individual chambers to the relationships between major structures. The great hypostyle hall, with its forest of 134 massive columns, was designed to represent the primordial marsh from which creation first emerged. The columns as papyrus stalks, their capitals blooming into stone flowers that supported a ceiling painted with stars. Walking through this hall was meant to be a journey backward through time, a return to the moment before creation, when all possibilities still existed in potential form. The columns themselves were not uniform, but carefully varied in their dimensions and decorations. creating subtle patterns that only became apparent when viewed from specific angles or during particular lighting conditions. Some scholars believe these patterns encoded astronomical data, the positions of stars, the cycles of planets, the complex mathematics of eclipse prediction. Others suggest they represented musical harmonies, the temple functioning as a kind of frozen symphony whose melodies could be perceived by those with the spiritual sensitivity to hear them. The truth may encompass both interpretations and more, for Karnak was designed to operate on multiple levels simultaneously, revealing different aspects of its meaning to observers at different stages of spiritual development. The sacred lake adjacent to the main temple complex served purposes both practical and mystical. Its waters were used for ritual purification, priests immersing themselves before entering the temple's inner precincts to wash away the contamination of the profane world. But the lake also represented the primordial waters of Nun, the infinite ocean of chaos from which Amun had first emerged. Ceremonies conducted on its shores reenacted the original creation, with priests taking the roles of the first gods and speaking the words that had called existence into being. These rituals were not mere commemorations, but actual participations in the ongoing process of creation. For Egyptian theology held that the universe required constant renewal, that without the proper rituals, existence itself might slip back into the chaos from which it had emerged. The innermost sanctuary of Karnak, where Amun's cult statue resided, was designed to be the most hidden place on earth, a physical manifestation of the god's essential nature as the concealed one. Access was restricted to the highest priests and the pharaoh himself, and even they could enter only after extensive purification rituals and at astronomically determined times. The sanctuary's walls were covered with texts and images that have never been fully deciphered, their meanings deliberately obscured through layers of symbolism and coded language. Some passages appear to describe mystical experiences, encounters with the divine that transcended normal consciousness, and revealed truths that could not be expressed in ordinary language. The cult statue itself was not a mere representation of Amun, but was believed to be actually inhabited by a portion of the god's essence. Each day, priests performed elaborate rituals of awakening, clothing, feeding, and entertaining the statue, treating it as a living being whose needs must be met and whose favor must be maintained. The food offerings placed before the statue were later distributed to the temple staff, creating an economic system in which divine blessing literally sustained human life. The clothing removed from the statue each evening was considered so sacred that it was carefully preserved, eventually being used to wrap the mummies of particularly favored individuals who sought to carry Amun's blessing into the afterlife. The expansion of Karnak over centuries created a palimpsest of sacred architecture, each generation's additions layered over and around those of their predecessors. This was not seen as problematic but as appropriate, for the temple was meant to grow organically like a living thing, its development reflecting the eternal unfolding of creation itself. Pharaohs competed to add the most impressive structures, their construction serving as permanent prayers in stone, declarations of devotion that would continue speaking to the god long after their builders had passed into the afterlife. The result was a complex that defied simple comprehension, a labyrinth of courts and halls and chapels that could take a lifetime to fully explore and understand. The priesthood of Amun developed into the most powerful religious institution the ancient world had ever seen, wielding influence that at times rivaled or exceeded that of the pharaohs themselves. But their power derived not merely from political maneuvering or economic control, though they possessed both in abundance. At its heart, the Amun priesthood claimed access to hidden knowledge, mystical techniques passed down through generations that allowed initiates to directly experience the divine presence and return transformed by the encounter. The training of an Amun priest began in childhood, with promising candidates identified through a combination of family lineage, physical perfection, and subtle signs that the priests interpreted as marks of divine favor. These children were removed from their families and brought to live within the temple complex, beginning an education that would consume decades of their lives. They learned to read and write the sacred hieroglyphic script, mastering not only its practical applications, but its mystical dimensions. For the Egyptians believed that hieroglyphs were not mere symbols, but actual embodiments of the things they represented, carrying power that could be activated through proper pronunciation and ritual context. Beyond literacy, the young priest studied astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and what we might call natural philosophy, the systematic observation and classification of the natural world. But these subjects were not taught as separate disciplines in the modern sense. All knowledge was understood as ultimately deriving from divine revelation, different facets of the single truth that Amun had spoken into existence at the moment of creation. A priest who understood the movements of the stars was not merely an astronomer, but a reader of divine intention, someone who could perceive the gods' plans written across the night sky. The higher mysteries of the Amun cult were revealed only to those who had proven themselves through years of dedicated service and demonstrated spiritual capacity. These teachings were never written down in full, preserved instead through oral transmission, from master to student, in unbroken chains reaching back to the temple's founding. What fragments have survived in written form are deliberately obscure, using symbolic language and mythological references that would have been meaningless to the uninitiated. Scholars have spent centuries attempting to reconstruct these teachings, with results that remain controversial and incomplete. What seems clear is that the highest levels of Amun worship involved direct mystical experience, encounters with the divine that transcended normal consciousness and revealed truths inaccessible to ordinary perception. Priests prepared for these experiences through extended fasting, sleep deprivation, and the ingestion of substances whose nature remains debated. Some researchers point to the blue lotus, a flower sacred to Egyptian religion, whose psychoactive properties are well documented. Others suggest more potent substances, perhaps derived from the acacia trees that grew in temple gardens, and whose bark contains compounds similar to those used in shamanic traditions worldwide. The mystical experiences themselves were understood as journeys into the hidden realm where Amun's true nature could be perceived. Priests reported encounters with beings of light, passage through geometric spaces that defied normal spatial logic, and moments of union with an infinite consciousness that encompassed all existence. These experiences were not considered hallucinations or delusions, but genuine perceptions of a reality normally hidden from human awareness. The priests who underwent them returned changed, carrying knowledge and perspectives that set them apart from ordinary humanity. This experiential dimension of Amun worship helps explain the priesthood's extraordinary confidence in their authority. They were not merely administrators of religious institutions or performers of traditional rituals. They were explorers of consciousness, travelers to realms that most humans would never see, bearers of knowledge that could not be obtained through any other means. When they spoke of Amun's will or interpreted divine signs, they did so with the authority of direct experience, not mere theological speculation. The political implications of this mystical authority were profound. Pharaohs might command armies and control the state apparatus, but the priests controlled access to the divine realm itself. A pharaoh who lost the priesthood's support risked being declared spiritually illegitimate, cut off from the divine favor that justified his rule. This gave the Amun priesthood leverage that they did not hesitate to use, intervening in succession disputes, influencing foreign policy, and accumulating wealth and land until they controlled a significant portion of Egypt's total resources. The reign of Amenhotep IV, who would rename himself Akhenaten, represents the most dramatic religious revolution in ancient history, a deliberate attempt to overthrow Amun and replace him with a deity whose nature was the precise opposite of hiddenness. The Aten, the visible disk of the sun, became the sole god of Akhenaten's new religion, worshipped not through mysterious rituals in darkened sanctuaries, but through direct exposure to sunlight, the god's presence made manifest and available to all who stood beneath the open sky. The psychological and spiritual motivations behind Akhenaten's revolution remain subjects of intense scholarly debate. Some see him as a genuine mystic who experienced a revelation that convinced him of the Aten's supreme divinity. Others view him as a political strategist who recognized that breaking the Amun priesthood's power required destroying their theological foundation. Still others suggest physical or mental illness, pointing to the strange artistic representations of Akhenaten's elongated skull and feminine body as evidence of conditions that might have produced unusual religious experiences or beliefs. What is certain is that Akhenaten's attack on Amun was systematic and thorough. He ordered the god's name chiseled from monuments throughout Egypt, dispatching teams of workers to climb scaffolding and deface inscriptions that had stood for centuries. The temples of Amun were closed, their revenues redirected to the new Aten cult, their priests dispersed or forced to convert. Even the word gods in its plural form was targeted, for Akhenaten insisted that only the Aten deserved divine status. All other deities were false, their worship not merely mistaken but actively evil. The new capital Akhenaten, built at Amarna, embodied his theological vision in architectural form. Where Karnak's temples were designed around hidden sanctuaries accessible only to the initiated, Amarna's Aten temples were open to the sky, their altars exposed to direct sunlight. Where Amun was worshipped through complex rituals performed in darkness, the Aten required only the simple act of standing in sunlight with upraised arms, receiving the god's blessing through his visible rays. Where Amun's nature was mysterious and hidden, requiring years of study and initiation to approach, the Aten was immediately present to anyone who simply looked up at the sky. This democratization of divine access threatened the entire structure of Egyptian religious authority. If anyone could worship the Aten directly, what need was there for priests? If the god's presence was visible to all, what value remained in esoteric knowledge and mystical initiation? Akhenaten seems to have recognized this implication, for he positioned himself as the sole intermediary between the Aten and humanity, not through hidden knowledge but through his unique status as the Aten's beloved son, the only human capable of truly understanding and communicating the god's will. The Amun priesthood's response to this persecution is poorly documented, for obvious reasons. Those who resisted openly were likely killed or imprisoned, while those who survived did so by keeping their continued devotion secret. But evidence suggests that Amun worship continued underground throughout Akhenaten's reign, preserved by priests who risked everything to maintain the ancient traditions. They gathered in private homes and hidden locations, performing abbreviated versions of the sacred rituals, passing on the mystical teachings to trusted students who would carry them forward until the madness passed. This period of persecution may have actually strengthened the Amun cult in certain ways. The experience of suffering for their faith deepened the priests' commitment and created a narrative of martyrdom that would resonate for generations. The hidden worship practiced during Akhenaten's reign also reinforced Amun's essential nature as the concealed god. What better proof of his hiddenness than his ability to survive, and even thrive while officially suppressed. When the Restoration came, the priests could point to their faithfulness during persecution as evidence of their special relationship with the God who had sustained them through the darkness. The death of Akhenaten and the subsequent abandonment of his religious revolution marked the beginning of Amun's greatest period of power and prestige. The young pharaoh, Tutankhamun, whose very name proclaimed the restoration, meaning living image of Amun, oversaw the reopening of the temples and the return of the priesthood to their former positions. But the restoration went far beyond simply reversing Akhenaten's changes. It initiated a theological and institutional expansion that would make Amun the supreme deity of the ancient world's greatest empire. The restoration decree issued in Tutankhamun's name described the state of Egypt under Atenist rule in apocalyptic terms. The temples had fallen into ruin, their sanctuaries overgrown with weeds. The gods had turned their backs on Egypt, refusing to answer prayers or grant requests. Military expeditions failed, diseases spread, and the cosmic order itself seemed to be unraveling. Whether this description was accurate or propagandistic exaggeration, it served to justify the massive investment of resources that followed: the rebuilding and expansion of temples, the restoration of priesthoods, the renewal of festivals and rituals that had been suppressed. The Amun priesthood emerged from the restoration with unprecedented power. They had proven their loyalty during persecution, maintaining the faith when doing so meant risking death. They had preserved the sacred knowledge that Akhenaten had tried to destroy, ensuring continuity with the ancient traditions. And they had been vindicated by history. The Atenist experiment had failed, while Amun endured. This gave them moral authority that translated into political and economic power, as grateful pharaohs showered the temples with gifts and privileges. The theological developments of the post-Akhenaten period reflected both the trauma of persecution and the triumph of restoration. Amun's hiddenness was now emphasized more strongly than ever, understood not merely as a divine attribute, but as a survival strategy that had allowed the god to endure when openly worshipped deities might have been destroyed. The mystical traditions of the priesthood were elaborated and systematized, creating hierarchies of initiation that would influence esoteric traditions for millennia. And Amun's universal sovereignty was proclaimed with new confidence. He was not merely the chief god of Egypt, but the supreme deity of all existence, other gods being merely aspects or emanations of his infinite nature. The Ramesside pharaohs who followed brought Amun worship to its greatest material expression. Ramesses II, the most prolific builder in Egyptian history, devoted enormous resources to Amun's temples, expanding Karnak to unprecedented size and constructing new sanctuaries throughout Egypt and Nubia. His military campaigns were conducted explicitly in Amun's name, the god's standards carried into battle, and his oracles consulted before major engagements. The famous Battle of Kadesh, whatever its actual military outcome, was commemorated as a divine intervention. Ramesses claimed that Amun himself had appeared on the battlefield, turning certain defeat into victory through supernatural power. The wealth flowing into Amun's temples during this period was staggering. Temple records from the reign of Ramesses III indicate that the Amun priesthood controlled over 400,000 head of cattle, 433 gardens and orchards, 83 ships, and 46 workshops, along with vast agricultural lands worked by tens of thousands of laborers. The high priest of Amun had become one of the most powerful figures in Egypt, his influence extending into every aspect of national life. Some high priests were members of the royal family, their appointment representing an attempt by pharaohs to keep this power within trusted hands. Others rose through the priestly ranks, their advancement reflecting both spiritual accomplishment and political skill. The expansion of Egyptian power during the New Kingdom carried Amun's worship far beyond the Nile Valley, establishing the hidden god as a truly international deity whose influence would shape religious development across the ancient Mediterranean world. From the gold mines of Nubia to the cedar forests of Lebanon, from the oases of the western desert to the trading posts of the Aegean, Amun's temples rose and his priests performed their mysteries, adapting the god's worship to local conditions while maintaining the essential core of his theology. Nubia, the land to Egypt's south, became particularly important to Amun's cult. The region's gold mines provided much of the wealth that funded temple construction, and Nubian soldiers formed elite units in the Egyptian army. But the relationship went deeper than economics or military alliance. Nubian religious traditions included worship of ram-headed deities that the Egyptians identified with Amun, creating a theological connection that predated political conquest. When Egyptian priests established Amun temples in Nubia, they were not simply imposing a foreign god, but recognizing and elaborating connections that local populations already acknowledged. The great temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal, built at the foot of a distinctive flat-topped mountain in what is now Sudan, became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in the ancient world. The mountain itself was believed to be Amun's primordial throne, the place from which he had first surveyed creation and found it good. Priests at Jebel Barkal developed their own mystical traditions, incorporating Nubian elements that gave their version of Amun worship a distinctive character. When Nubian kings eventually conquered Egypt itself, establishing the 25th dynasty, they did so explicitly as Amun's champions, claiming that the god had chosen them to restore proper worship after a period of Egyptian decline. The Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, located in the western desert near the border with Libya, achieved fame throughout the Mediterranean world. Greek travelers brought back reports of its accuracy and power, and the oracle's pronouncements influenced events far beyond Egypt's borders. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, one of his first acts was to make the dangerous journey across the desert to consult the Siwa oracle. What the priest told him there remained a closely guarded secret, but Alexander emerged claiming divine parentage. He was, he announced, the son of Zeus Ammon, the Greek interpretation of Amun that had developed through centuries of cultural contact. This identification of Amun with Zeus represented a crucial development in the god's universal expansion. Greek philosophers and theologians, encountering Amun's sophisticated theology of hiddenness and transcendence, recognized parallels with their own developing concepts of divine nature. The Amun who existed before creation, who was simultaneously hidden and omnipresent, who could not be fully comprehended by mortal minds. This was a deity that resonated with Greek philosophical speculation of the nature of ultimate reality. The synthesis that resulted, Zeus Ammon, became one of the most widely worshipped deities of the Hellenistic world, his cult spreading to Greece, Rome, and beyond. The Romans, inheriting Greek religious traditions, continued to honor Zeus Ammon, though the cult gradually declined as new religious movements captured popular imagination. But Amun's influence persisted in less obvious ways. The theological concepts developed by his priesthood, divine hiddenness, mystical union, hierarchies of spiritual initiation, would reappear in Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and eventually in the mystical traditions of Christianity and Islam. The hidden god of Thebes had become a permanent part of humanity's spiritual heritage, his influence extending far beyond the temples that had crumbled into ruin. The concept of divine hiddenness that Amun embodied represents one of humanity's most profound theological insights, an understanding of ultimate reality that would influence religious and philosophical thought for millennia after the last Amun priest performed his final ritual. To fully appreciate this legacy, we must examine the philosophical implications of hiddenness as a divine attribute, what it means for a god to be essentially concealed, and how this concealment paradoxically reveals the deepest truths about the nature of existence. The hiddenness of Amun was not merely a poetic description or a priestly mystification designed to enhance the god's prestige. It was a serious theological claim about the nature of ultimate reality, that the ground of all existence necessarily transcends the categories through which finite minds comprehend the world. Just as the eye cannot see itself seeing, just as thought cannot fully grasp the thinker who thinks it, so the ultimate source of all existence cannot be captured by any concept or image derived from that existence. Amun's hiddenness was thus not a limitation but a logical necessity, a recognition that the infinite cannot be contained by the finite. This understanding placed Amun's theology in conversation with the deepest questions of philosophy. How can we know anything about a reality that transcends our capacity for knowledge? How can we speak meaningfully about that which exceeds all speech? How can we worship a god who cannot be seen, touched, or fully conceived? The Amun priesthood developed sophisticated responses to these questions, responses that anticipated philosophical developments that would not fully emerge in the Western tradition until centuries later. Their answer centered on the concept of manifestation, the idea that while Amun's essential nature remained forever hidden, he continuously revealed himself through his effects in the world. The sun's light was Amun's visible radiance, the wind his breath, the fertility of the land his blessing. Every phenomenon in nature could be read as a sign of the hidden god's presence, a partial revelation of the infinite reality that could never be fully disclosed. This allowed for genuine knowledge of Amun, not knowledge of his essence, which remained forever beyond comprehension, but knowledge of his activities, his character as revealed through his works. The mystical practices of the Amun priesthood represented another approach to the problem of knowing the unknowable. Through ritual, meditation, and perhaps pharmacological assistance, initiates sought direct experience of the divine presence, not intellectual comprehension but immediate awareness, a knowing that transcended the subject-object distinction of ordinary consciousness. These experiences were understood as genuine encounters with Amun, moments when the barrier between hidden and revealed temporarily dissolved, and the initiate participated directly in divine reality. The knowledge gained through such experiences could not be fully communicated in words, but it transformed those who underwent it, giving them certainty that no argument could shake. The influence of these ideas on later religious and philosophical traditions is difficult to overstate. When Greek philosophers developed concepts of the one beyond being, the ineffable source of all existence that could be approached only through negation and mystical assent, they were working with ideas that had been explored for centuries in Amun's temples. When Gnostic teachers spoke of the hidden God beyond the Creator, the ultimate reality concealed behind the visible cosmos, they drew on theological frameworks that Amun's priests had pioneered. When Christian mystics described the divine darkness, the cloud of unknowing in which God's presence was most fully encountered, they continued a tradition of apophatic theology that found one of its earliest expressions in ancient Thebes. The decline of Amun's worship was not a sudden collapse but a gradual fading that stretched across nearly a millennium. As new religious movements arose, political circumstances changed, and the ancient traditions slowly lost their hold on popular imagination. Yet even in decline, Amun's cult demonstrated remarkable resilience, adapting to changed circumstances and finding new forms of expression that allowed it to survive long after the great age of temple building had ended. The conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE initiated a new phase in Amun's history. The Ptolemaic dynasty that Alexander's general established maintained and even expanded the traditional temples, recognizing that support for Egyptian religion was essential to their legitimacy as rulers. Greek and Egyptian religious traditions increasingly merged, with Amun identified with Zeus and worshipped in forms that combined elements of both cultures. The temple of Amun at Karnak continued to function, its priests performing the ancient rituals even as the world around them transformed. But the Ptolemaic period also saw the rise of new cults that competed for popular devotion. Serapis, a deity deliberately created to appeal to both Greek and Egyptian sensibilities, attracted worshippers who might previously have turned to Amun. Isis, whose cult had always been popular, expanded dramatically, her worship spreading throughout the Mediterranean world and eventually reaching Rome itself. These newer cults offered more accessible forms of devotion, emotional satisfaction, and promises of personal salvation that the austere theology of Amun's hiddenness could not easily match. The Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE brought further changes. The Romans, like the Ptolemies, initially maintained the traditional temples, recognizing their importance to social stability. But Roman religious policy was fundamentally different from that of native Egyptian rulers. The temples were no longer centers of political power, but monuments to be preserved and occasionally visited by curious tourists. The priesthoods continued their rituals, but with diminishing resources and declining numbers of initiates. The great festivals that had once drawn crowds from across Egypt became increasingly perfunctory, their cosmic significance fading into mere tradition. The rise of Christianity delivered the final blow to Amun's worship. The new religion, with its exclusive claims and missionary zeal, could not coexist with traditional Egyptian religion as earlier conquerors had. Christian emperors issued edicts closing the temples and forbidding pagan worship. Monks and zealots attacked the ancient sanctuaries, defacing images and destroying texts that had preserved knowledge accumulated over millennia. The last priests of Amun, their numbers dwindled to a handful, performed their final rituals in secret, passing on what they could of the ancient wisdom before the chain of transmission was finally broken. Yet Amun's influence did not entirely disappear. Elements of his theology survived in the Hermetic tradition, a body of philosophical and mystical texts that claimed to preserve ancient Egyptian wisdom. These texts, rediscovered during the Renaissance, would profoundly influence Western esotericism, carrying ideas that had originated in Amun's temples into the modern world. The concept of the hidden god, the practices of mystical initiation, the understanding of reality as a hierarchy of manifestations from an unknowable source. All these continued to shape religious and philosophical thought long after the last temple had fallen into ruin. As we conclude this exploration of Amun, the hidden god of ancient Egypt, we must ask what meaning his story holds for us today. Across more than 3,000 years, from the first stirrings of his cult in Thebes to the final extinction of his worship under Christian persecution, Amun represented humanity's attempt to grapple with the deepest mysteries of existence. His story is not merely ancient history, but a chapter in the ongoing human quest to understand our place in the cosmos and our relationship to whatever ultimate reality underlies the world we experience. The concept of divine hiddenness that Amun embodied speaks to a permanent feature of human experience, the sense that reality extends beyond what we can perceive or comprehend, that the visible world is not the whole of existence, but a surface beneath which deeper truths lie concealed. This intuition has found expression in virtually every human culture, from the mystical traditions of the East to the philosophical speculations of the West. Amun's priests were among the first to systematically explore this intuition, developing theological and practical frameworks for approaching the hidden dimension of reality that would influence human thought for millennia. The political history of Amun's cult offers lessons that remain relevant today. The relationship between religious authority and political power, the use of divine sanction to legitimate rule, the potential for religious institutions to accumulate wealth and influence that rivals or exceeds that of secular governments. All these dynamics played out in ancient Egypt and continue to shape our world. The Amun priesthood's rise to power, their conflict with Akhenaten's revolutionary monotheism, and their eventual decline under foreign rule and religious competition provide a case study in the complex interactions between faith and politics that still demand our attention. The mystical traditions of Amun worship raise questions about the nature of religious experience that remain unresolved. Were the visions and encounters reported by Amun's priests genuine perceptions of transcendent reality, or were they products of suggestion, expectation, and perhaps pharmacological manipulation? The question cannot be definitively answered, but it points to larger issues about the relationship between brain states and spiritual experiences, between subjective certainty and objective truth. These issues are as pressing today as they were in ancient Thebes, as neuroscience and contemplative traditions continue their uneasy dialogue about the nature of consciousness and its possible connections to realities beyond the physical. Perhaps most importantly, Amun's story reminds us of the impermanence of even the most powerful and seemingly permanent institutions. For over 2,000 years, Amun's temples dominated the Egyptian landscape. His priests wielded enormous power, and his worship seemed as eternal as the Nile itself. Yet today, those temples are ruins visited by tourists. The priesthood has vanished entirely, and Amun's name is known only to scholars and enthusiasts. This fate awaits all human institutions, all our certainties and powers. The hidden god who emerged from primordial chaos has returned to hiddenness, his temples silent, his mysteries forgotten. But perhaps this is fitting. Amun was always the hidden one, the god who could not be fully known or captured in any form. His disappearance from active worship may be understood not as a defeat, but as a return to his essential nature, a withdrawal into the concealment that was always his truest mode of being. And in that hiddenness, he remains present, for the questions he embodied have not been answered, the mysteries he represented have not been solved. Wherever humans sense that reality extends beyond appearance, wherever they seek the infinite behind the finite, wherever they pursue wisdom that transcends ordinary knowledge, there Amun endures, hidden as always, waiting to be discovered anew. The breath that stirred the primordial waters still moves through the world. The hidden god still hides, and humanity still seeks, as it has always sought, to penetrate the mystery and touch, however briefly, the infinite reality that Amun's priests knew by the name of the Hidden One.